welcome to Greenheart Connects. I'm Marcel and I'll be your host. Thank you for being here. Greenheart Connects is an online monthly series where like-minded people gather and exchange ideas for caring for the earth and for each other. Through facilitated discussions and curated presentations, people from around the world share inspiring stories, tips, suggestions, and resources to improve local communities and the world. Greenheart Connects is brought to you by Greenheart International, a not-for-profit organization facilitating global understanding through cultural exchange programs for Americans and young people from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Exchange has the power to broaden perspectives and to change lives. We think you'll be inspired by what we have to share with you today. Greenheart Connects dives into several themes throughout the year: environmentalism, volunteerism, fair trade, and personal growth. Today, we are talking with the former U.S. Ambassador to Georgia, Ian Kelly, and Rich Zacaroli, Chair of the Greenheart International Board of Directors, about the importance of activism. Your civic activism matters. It leads to global conversations. Governments, corporations, they do listen, and change can happen. Ian and Rich will talk to us about what they have witnessed and how citizen diplomacy has changed the world dialogue. We think you'll be inspired. After the presentation, we will meet back here for a live Q&A. So, are you ready? Let's go.
Hi, I'm Rich Zacaroli. I am on the board of directors and chair of the board of Greenheart International. And I'm here today with my colleague, Ian Kelly. Ian, say hello.
Hi, guys.
Today we're here to talk about citizen diplomacy and what it is, what it means, and how we as ordinary citizens move institutions to act more responsibly. So what is citizen diplomacy? Basically, citizen diplomacy is a concept where we all have a right, a responsibility to help shape relations between our country and other countries around the world by our behavior, really, presenting the best of what we are in our countries, one handshake at a time. Citizen diplomats can be any one of us. It can be teachers, it can be students, athletes, business people who participate in the international business community, artists, humanitarians, soldiers, obviously, diplomats, adventurers, and it can be tourists. How we behave as individuals when we're traveling internationally as tourists exemplify how our society behaves. And so we're all citizen diplomats in that regard. Greenheart International has a model for citizen diplomacy in itself. You could say we're really in the citizen diplomacy business. Our mission is connecting people and planet to create global leaders. Many people who have been through international student exchange programs, for example, go on to become global leaders. There's a statistic actually that says 80% of global leaders have been through some sort of a international exchange program. Our citizen diplomacy initiatives are cultural exchange, work exchange programs, educational exchange programs, bringing students from all over the world into classrooms and families in the United States, and sending students from the U.S. All over the world. And fair trade is a component of our citizen diplomacy initiatives. Ian is going to talk about the role of governments and citizen groups in citizen diplomacy, and then I'll talk about the role of the business sector in citizen diplomacy. So, Ian, take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Rich. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you all. I spent 33 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, about 2/3 of that time overseas. My last post was ambassador in Tbilisi, Georgia. And really the first half of my career, I was involved in the whole idea of citizen diplomacy. And I ran a number of exchange programs. in both Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union. I saw how exchange programs really enhance mutual understanding and contribute to international peace. I want to talk to you today about the importance of community action and how it can be so very impactful in terms of making change and effecting a difference. Americans, I think, know that democracy does not end on election day. It's important that our elected representatives understand what is important to us, and we show them what is important by our actions. What I have found as a diplomat of many years overseas is that local actions by Americans don't just stay local. Grassroots movements by Americans become global phenomena. The world watches what Americans do. This is especially true in countries whose governments place limitations on expression or seek to hide what they are doing from their own citizens. When America protests, these protests really empower people overseas to take up the same issue. So let me give you 3 examples of how local actions in the United States became global. And I also want to show you how US diplomats have become force multipliers for some of these now global phenomena. So Earth Day was first commemorated on April 22nd, 1970. I was a high school student at the time, and our high school gave us several options of how we could demonstrate our commitment to the environment. I chose a pickup along the Chicago River. As a teenager, I was really horrified how thoughtless Americans were in disposing of their trash in parks and in nature preserves. So that was my chosen activity on Earth Day 50 years ago. Earth Day, of course, has become a global phenomenon, and embassies all over the world on April 22nd have activities to mark Earth Day and to raise awareness about the importance of respecting the environment. And when my staff asked me what I thought we should do on Earth Day, I was really quite concerned about the amount of litter along Tbilisi's main river. So I suggested to the mayor that we have a joint activity with both diplomats and young people. That's Ambassador Kaka Kaladze, the mayor of Tbilisi, and he's suiting up there along with young people from Tbilisi to go pick up the litter along Tbilisi's main river. Another important event that went from being local protests to a worldwide phenomenon is Gay Pride Day. Gay Pride was also started in 1970. It was first celebrated as a parade in big cities on the first anniversary of violence committed against LGBTQ individuals in New York City at a tavern called the Stonewall Pub. And similarly to Earth Day, embassies have events organized around the issue of Gay Pride Day, and they use Gay Pride Day to show support for the idea of human rights, and also to raise awareness of the challenges that gay individuals face. Gay pride is especially poignant, I think, in countries that ban gay pride parades. In Russia, for example, there is legislation that forbids what they call the advocacy of the gay lifestyle. and therefore gay prides are prohibited. But the embassy very proudly shows its support for gay rights on one of the busiest avenues in Moscow. Embassy Moscow considers it particularly important that they show their support for the rights of embattled LGBTQ individuals. In Tbilisi, my last post, there was no such law that limited LGBTQ individuals from expressing their views. There was, however, a lot of hostility towards gay persons. The first time that the community tried to march in downtown Tbilisi, they were met with hostility from the more traditional conservative elements of Georgian society. And so one of my jobs at the embassy was to ensure that LGBTQ individuals could express their views and raise awareness about their challenges in a peaceful way. So the government gave them basically the courtyard of the main government building in Tbilisi. And you can see that there were far more policemen than actual demonstrators. But it was important that the government provide this kind of protection to show that they respect the rights of expression of all their citizens. And then finally, the most recent local phenomenon that became global, of course, is Black Lives Matter. Those demonstrations in the United States, which were broadcast all over the world, coincided with gay pride events that embassies sponsored overseas. And you can see that in Seoul, Korea, in addition to displaying the rainbow flag, also displayed a two-story banner saying Black Lives Matter, showing their support for justice for people of color. And like Earth Day and Gay Pride Day, the protests after the murder of George Floyd went global, and there were protests all over the world. These protests really kind of took on sort of a local emphasis. And in Europe, here we see a protest of young people in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. In Europe, it tended to be protests about the lack of justice for those who had suffered either during colonialism and the exploitation of people of color, particularly in Africa, and also the lack of respect for the rights of refugees from countries to the south of Europe. So the main theme in these protests was the idea of justice. And even Tbilisi, which has very few people of color living in the capital city, even in Tbilisi there were protests. The emphasis there was the idea of ending police violence, and this is because, unfortunately, in Tbilisi the police have tended to resort to force too quickly and too often when there are protests. It's really very important that you appreciate that your civic engagement, your involvement in promoting important issues and bringing them to the attention of governments, that it's not just necessarily going to be a local phenomenon. Because of the attention given to the United States and our priority on allowing citizens to express their views, people pay attention to what we do. And many of the issues that you find important, you will also find are important in countries where you may be studying. What I've tried to show here is how our actions locally can have an impact globally, how together We can make changes. We can make a difference. Rich will now talk about how citizens' actions can change, in addition to governments, also it can change the policies of corporations. And that's because just as governments have to be responsive to voters, corporations have to be responsive to customers and investors. Rich, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Appreciate it. Just a couple of things about me and my background. I've got about 43 years of experience in the business sector. In addition to that, I've got roughly 30 years in board governance, serving on primarily non-for-profit boards and social, educational sectors and banking sectors. I've worked internationally. I've done business in roughly 30 of the 55 or so countries that I have visited in the last 40 years. And I lived as a expatriate in Rome, Italy for 9 years of my career. So I've seen how our companies, present themselves and act as citizens diplomacy around the world. I've run a small, a medium-sized company of about 200 people and served in both large Fortune 500 companies and startup companies. So I'm gonna look at it from the perspective of the business sector and what the business sector must do to practice good diplomacy, both domestically and internationally. And why must the business sector step up? Well, the business sector is the largest segment of virtually any economy anywhere in the world. Gross domestic product, as you may or may not know, is the value of all the goods and services that are manufactured in a specific country in a specific period of time. And in the United States and in Europe, the business sector represents nearly 80% of the gross domestic product. That's pretty representative of the entire industrialized world. Consequently, the business sector has the greatest single impact on the economy, on the environment, and on people's lives, and therefore has a mandate to act responsibly in the world. Businesses measure how well they're performing in living up to their responsibilities to the environment and social and governance objectives in their corporate social responsibility plans. And what is corporate social responsibility, or CSR? It's a concept whereby companies should be integrating social and environmental concerns into all of their business operations seamlessly. And in their interactions with their shareholders and their stakeholders being their employees, the communities in which they operate, and as stewards of the environment. There are three pillars to corporate social responsibility: environmental, how well you're doing to manage resources and resource depletion, minimize your footprint on the environment, and minimize waste and pollution. Social, how are the working conditions that you're providing for your employees? Health and safety aspects, employee relations and diversity throughout your organization, and your interface with local communities. And then governance, which deals with legal issues such as bribery and corruption and doing business in a way that discourages and eliminates bribery and corruption. Board diversity and structure. Does your board of directors of your corporation represent the community in which you operate, your customer community? It's tax strategy, which drives responsible behavior in the world, and executive pay. So we're going to talk about briefly good and perhaps a couple of bad examples of each one of those. I'm going to start with the environment, a critical issue in this era of climate change. And here the European business and European governments really lead the world in environmental protection spending. Environmental protection spending in the European Union is about 2.2% of the European Union's GDP, compared to only 0.4% in the United States. And the fact is, the US ranks 27th in environmental performance around the world, behind Europe, but still well ahead of China and India. That's an example of how we're doing as stewards of the environment. Although U.S. companies are improving in their environmental performance, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. On to the social pillar. In 1998, the international community implemented the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work Act, which commits member states to respect and promote principles and workers' rights in 4 categories. 1, the freedom to organize and form unions, the elimination of forced or compulsory labor and child labor, the elimination of discrimination based on race, sex, sexual orientation, etc., in respect to employee and occupation. And most U.S. companies and multinational companies are leading in this area and are requiring suppliers in developing countries to certify that these principles are being followed and adhered to. And most perform supplier audits to verify that international suppliers are actually complying with the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work Act. Fair trade brings this to a whole new level. A fair trade certification demands even an extra amount of diligence in working conditions, workers' rights, and our environmental advocacy, bringing it to a whole new level. The U.S. passed in 1997 the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA as it's called. And since then, we've really led the world. U.S. corporations and the U.S. government have led the world in driving out corruptive practices such as bribery out of domestic and all international business dealings. And all major and most even small and medium-sized companies have mandatory annual Foreign Corrupt Practices Act training for all of their employees, representatives, and agents, including international agents who deal directly with customers and suppliers. So driving corruption out of business has been a major focus of the U.S. government in collaboration with U.S. companies for the last 20 plus years. Social and income inequality. Here we haven't been doing so good. In the U.S., corporate profits have been rising over the past 40 years, while total wages have been declining as a percent of gross domestic product. And in the meantime, executive pay increases have far outpaced increases in worker pay by 10 or more times. Both factors are contributing and have contributed to income and social inequality. The U.S. is rated fairly low in terms of social and income inequality relative to other industrialized countries. And here, advocacy at the grassroots level is really needed to correct some of the inequities that we see in worker pay and in corporate profits. Corporate social responsibility. How can we as citizens, global citizens, have an impact? When asked how organizations are doing living up to their corporate social responsibility programs, only 18% of the respondents said that corporate social responsibility is a top priority and is reflected in all aspects of the corporation's strategy. Nearly 60%, 56%, said that it's not at all a focus or not a well-developed concept, nor is it invested in our companies. So here, grassroots advocacy by employees and communities in which these companies operate can cause these corporations to really bring CSR initiatives to the top as top priorities and as reflected in the corporation's missions and strategies. And grassroots advocacy is really just another term for citizen-based activism, what we can, as citizens, can do to encourage corporations to be more socially responsible in terms of the 3 pillars that we talked about previously. And this is an example of where how grassroots advocacy has had an impact on the way corporations behave. U.S. corporations, as you can see, have significantly increased sustainable and responsible investing, with investments in sustainable and responsible investing growing at rates of 35 to 40% per year over the last 10 years. So this is really good news. Environmental initiatives are one of the main pillars of sustainable and responsible investing, but more can and should be done by corporations to be responsible stewards in collaboration with, and even sometimes in the absence of, government leadership in these areas. So in closing, our institutions, our governments, our businesses, the corporate sector act responsibly when we as citizens demand them to act responsibly. And how do we do that? Well, we do it by voting in national, state, and local elections for candidates that advocate legislation focused on acting more responsibly as organizations, as a government, and as corporate citizens. We also do it by advocating at the grassroots level. We do it by organizing into labor groups and citizen groups, by meeting with lawmakers with a united message, by hosting elected officials and their staffs in our place of business or community center, and sharing what we believe are best practices with them so that they can look at how in legislation they can drive those best practices home. By participating in letter writing and social media campaigns to lawmakers and to business executives, by attending political events, by peaceful demonstration, and by engaging as citizens in our communities and activities such as community projects. And we can do it by setting an example, by being responsible citizen diplomats in our communities and around the world as we deal with our international partners and friends.
Is Rich from the Bay Area and Ian from Windtree, Chicago. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Pleasure.
All right, well, first of all, we would like to thank you for the fascinating presentation, and I'm sure many of us already have some questions lined up. Before we get to the Q&A segment for today, let's build a sense of community. So I'd like to ask everyone who's joining us today in the comment section below, please say your name, where you're joining us from, and ask a question. I'll be sure to ask Rich and Ian during our Q&A time today. So I will start. So it's not every day that we get to have a dialogue with a former ambassador. Ian, can you talk to us about your role as an ambassador? Specifically, what was that like on a daily basis?
Well, thanks a lot, Marcel. It's a real pleasure to be on this with my good friend Rich, and I look forward to engaging with the participants. Yeah, I mean, being an ambassador is a pretty sweet gig, I have to say. You know, the greatest Secretary of State of his generation, George Shultz, who sadly passed away at age 100 just a few days ago, used to take newly appointed American ambassadors to his office, show them the globe, and say to them, "Show me what is your country?" And of course, they'd always point to whatever country they were assigned to, and Schultz would take their hand gently and move it to the United States of America and said, "That's your country." And that is something that every ambassador has to keep foremost in his or her mind. The idea that you are there to represent the United States of America and all of its interests and all of its citizens too. I mean, that is job number one, looking after the welfare of American citizens, American business, and all of our foreign policy priorities. I think, one way to describe life as an ambassador, it really is life in a fishbowl. The American ambassador is always in the center of attention, whether or not the country is adversarial or friendly. And so much of what an ambassador does is use that bully pulpit to present the American perspective and also to promote America, to promote American business, promote American educational opportunities, investment opportunities, and all ambassadors, all foreign service officers have to be focused like a laser on that idea of representing the United States in the country.
Absolutely, and it's not a small job, to say the least. And I'm going to follow up on that, but actually moving to Rich, because you were living in Rome, in Italy, for quite a long time. In your capacity there, did you have interactions with the US Embassy and or the ambassador during your time there? And if you did, what was the purpose and or how do you see that benefiting the many parties that are involved?
Great. Thanks for that question. And it is a pleasure to be here with my good friend, Ian. Yeah, while I was living in Italy, I was actually doing business, responsible for business development and program management for our companies. I was based in Chicago at the time. The company was based in Chicago for all of Europe and the Middle East. So I've done business in over 30 different countries around the world. And very frequently, and almost invariably in every country where we were poised to do business, I would go into the U.S. Embassy offices there and meet with the commerce desks, and that was very useful from a couple of standpoints. First of all, they were able to point us to resources that we could leverage in order to do business more successfully in those countries. And but more importantly, I think, was an introduction to those countries' business customs and practices, in how to best adapt our approach to the culture of that country that we were trying to do business in. So from that perspective, it's the embassies, the State Department, and the embassies in each country, and U.S. business interests, I think, have a very collaborative relationship for the purpose of promoting U.S. products and businesses, and U.S. business practices and ethics worldwide.
And it is so important to maintain that relationship and have that open communication, so that the business community can prosper and ultimately the American interest is served. And going back to Ian, how does our government quantify the success of an ambassador's or embassy's relationships? Obviously, using Rich's example of having the regular meetings seem to help. Anything else that you can share in terms of quantifying the relationship?
Well, it depends on the country. I mean, every country has a different set of goals, but I think you put your finger on one of the real difficult parts of being a diplomat. Being a diplomat is really all about human relations and being able to persuade foreign publics to support the American values, and that's extremely difficult to quantify, obviously. However, one way that we do quantify it is is in an economic sense. The number of businesses that are able to operate successfully in the country, being able to promote U.S. exports into the country. Those are things that are very much quantifiable, and we have to do a lot with the host country to enable American businesses to be successful. So we have to work with the legislature to make sure that the laws are fair and have there's an even playing field for U.S. businesses, that taxes are not too high on or taxes or customs fees, and all ambassadors spend a significant amount of time trying to smooth the way for U.S. business.
Thank you for sharing that. I am keeping up with the comment section of the Greenheart Connects, and it looks like we have quite a few questions already, so I will go through them. The first one is, we have a question from Carol. She said, I've heard a lot recently about choosing an ethical bank. What is the best way to evaluate a bank or any corporation that we support with our business to make sure that the organization is truly socially responsible in meaningful ways? How and where do ordinary citizens check this?
That's yours, Rich.
Well, I'll take a shot at that. I think the answer is probably more complicated than the question is, but one place I would start is to look at that bank's or that corporation's website. Most major corporations now, I would say nearly all major corporations now and banks have corporate social responsibility initiatives, and they report on those initiatives on an annual basis. So that would be a good place to start. That would give you, I think, some idea of what types of business activities that those banks typically invest and engage in, where they invest the money you put in those banks. Aside from that, I think looking at consumer advocate sites and those kinds of things are helpful as well. But I would definitely start with the website and look and see if that organization or that bank has a corporate social responsibility report for their activities in the last year and how they're measuring themselves, their performance against their goals.
Thanks for that, Rich. I do have a follow-up question, because I think now, especially young people, they are very, they want to hold everyone accountable. They want to make sure that it's not just a slogan, it's not just, a very beautiful plan that is on an organization's website, which is a good thing to do. We need to have that checks and balances. So my question is, how can we hold the corporations accountable? And is there any way that we, as an outsider, measure that and making sure that those things are followed?
My question again, I guess. I think, gosh, of course, one of the main ways we as consumers hold corporations responsible for doing good in the world is by buying from them or not buying from them. And that's our number one choice as a consumer. And when we're making major consumption decisions, consumer decisions, as it regards automobiles and things like that, I think if we are civic minded, we'll look at what they're doing and how they're doing it. I think that would be one way, and then make our buying decision based on that. Other ways are, if that business is operating in your community, and you believe that perhaps they're not doing things in the best interest of that community, from an environmental perspective, from a social responsibility objective, etc., then organize and go in and talk to the leaders of that corporation or that division in that community, and have that discussion with them. I think those are the two major ways we make decisions, or we drive companies to do the right things, is by our consumption decisions, or whether we buy from or don't buy from them, and organizing as community activists to make them do the right things if they're not doing the right things.
Absolutely. I see a comment from one of our viewers here. Her name is Renee. She mentioned that as leaders and fanning the power of young global leaders, we can remind everyone that their purchases and voices are powerful. A
Yes.
young person may not be buying large ticket items or stock today, but they will be in the future. So really affirming what you were saying earlier, Rich. So I have a somewhat of a maybe a lighthearted question. We have Nicole here joining us from snowy Chicago. She is asking, what is something in the way that Italians do things or live and Georgians do that you think the US can learn from that you try to incorporate in your life? So maybe we can pose this question to Ian first.
It's a great question. And, one of the, I think one of the real pleasures of living overseas is seeing how other people approach challenges and live their lives. And I think that Georgians and Italians share one thing. They share many things in common, I'm sure, but one thing is the real emphasis on the family, particularly on the weekends. The weekends in both countries are considered sacrosanct. And so, I would never approach the government in Georgia on a weekend because that's family time. And if you go to a restaurant, I'm sure Rich noticed this too, but on Sundays, the restaurants are full of families, and so that's the tradition that everybody gets together, many different generations, and I admire both societies for that. We Americans are very mobile, which is good in an economic sense. We go where jobs are, but in some ways, we have a hard time kind of forming a community. And especially staying in touch with family, and I don't mean just immediate family, but the broader family. So I admire both Georgia and Italy for that real priority of family time.
I would agree with everything Ian said. I would sum it up in work-life balance. I think
Right.
The Italians and I've done a lot of business in Greece and in Spain and other places around Europe in particular have a focus on work-life balance. Unlike us, you won't find them generally sitting in front of their computers 16 hours a day working. They stop for lunch, they have a nice lunch, they stop for dinner, they enjoy their family time and their evening time. I'll spend 1 minute talking about one real life example. I had a number of years ago with U.S. corporation that I was working in. We had teamed with a large Italian company, and I won't name the company, for a large U.S. government contract. And they were to be a subcontractor to us. They were a subcontractor to us. And we were going through the source selection process with the U.S. government customer in August of this particular year. And we needed the support of the Italian company in order to address some of the questions that they were asking in the source selection process. But it was August, and the company had shut down and completely shut down. And there was no one in the company that could support us during the source selection activity in August. And we had to try and we had to cajole the customer into deferring that part of the source selection process until September when they came back to work. So
if I can add one small little anecdote as well. Rich and I met in Rome. I was assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Rome. And my first week there, I'd come out of Washington and I was doing the Washington thing at noon. I was having a sandwich at my desk. And one of my Italian staff came into my office, looked absolutely horrified and said, "What are you doing? Why are you having your lunch at your desk? Get outside."
That's right.
You shouldn't stay in the office all day. Find some friends, have lunch with them. And that's the way it is. And so you have those, it's really 2 hours for lunch, not an hour.
Yeah.
In Italy, at least 2 hours. And I never had lunch at my desk again.
Yeah.
When in
Eating
Rome.
lunch in an Italian factory, being a guest in an Italian manufacturing facility was always very interesting because the cafeteria was as good as any 3 or 4-star restaurant in the United States, number one.
Absolutely.
And number two, you always went from your dining table to a bar for your espresso and an aperitif, an after dinner drink, along with your espresso if you wanted it before you went back to work. I often thought about, wow, what about these folks who are running machinery in this factory? I guess they didn't have accidents and those kinds of things, but it was a completely different approach to it. And
Right.
and the lunch conversation was as important as the meeting conversation was.
Exactly. I mean, you can actually, as a diplomat, you can get things done over lunch.
Yeah.
In terms of having a good conversation, a good discussion. So I take journalists out to lunch all the time. And I'll say, one thing about, you mentioned how you get 4-star cooking in a factory cafeteria. I was there 4 years. I have to say, I only had one bad meal in a restaurant, and that was in a restaurant that was right across from the Coliseum, and no Italian was in the restaurant. And it was clear that they had, frozen vegetables, and they'd microwave the pasta, and no Italian would ever do anything like that. They would never microwave pasta or use frozen vegetables. So yeah, it's absolutely true about Italy.
Sad to say, I know the place.
I'm sure you do.
Well, the Italians know how to do it, and how do we say it? La dolce vita, is that right?
Si mangia bene.
Vero.
Si mangia bene. And I completely understand about places being shut down in August, because we made that mistake once. We went to Italy in August, and a lot of the places are closed. They're touristy places, they're still open, but you wanted to explore to the more off the beaten path, and you have to remember that it's so different compared to the US. And I know a lot of people.
Personally, I love being in Rome, Italy in August because you can find a parking place. So.
Yeah, and there's not long lines for museums and things like that.
True.
That's right. All right, let's get to the another question that we have here. We have Jack Blanks from Sacramento. He wants to say, thanks to Ian and Rich for an enlightening presentation. And this question is for Ian. As a Peace Corps volunteer in the early 70s, I learned firsthand how important cross-cultural exchange is to world understanding. As a US diplomat, did you have interaction with Peace Corps volunteers? And what is your opinion on the importance of the Peace Corps as citizen diplomats?
Boy, you're really pitching me a softball there with talk about the importance of Peace Corps volunteers. One of the great things about being an ambassador is you get to travel all over the country, and that's it's part of your job, to show the flag, not just in the capital, but all over the country. And Georgia has an extraordinary number of Peace Corps volunteers. It's around 75 or so, and they're all over the country. And I used to, jokingly, call them, all of my regional diplomats, because that's what they are. I mean, they are, they're living, breathing, walking, working Americans out working with the Georgians, showing how important or how much we want Georgia to succeed economically and otherwise. And I'd always make it a point to, wherever I go, to meet with the Peace Corps volunteers and find out what their concerns were. They'd be living really a very rustic life. Georgia, in many ways, you get out into the mountainous regions, and it's almost kind of a pre-industrial age in some of these small villages where Peace Corps volunteers are. I am a huge fan of the Peace Corps, and I must say it's also a great kind of feeder organization or a AAA team for the Foreign Service. A lot of my colleagues came into the Foreign Service with experience in the Peace Corps, and that's because their experience is very much a kind of a people-to-people diplomatic experience. And the best Foreign Service officers are the ones who get out and don't just stay at their desk and get outside of the Capitol.
I'm going to follow up on that. You mentioned something about the USA hanging, the flag at the US Embassy. There's a quote from Ben Franklin: "The qualities of a diplomat are sleepless tact, unmovable calmness, and a patience that no folly, no provocation, and no blunders may shake." So,
Wow.
how does the government react after the US hangs a flag on the embassy supporting something that might be considered controversial?
Yeah.
How does that work for you or your life back then as an ambassador?
Well, I mean, I was very fortunate to serve in Georgia. It's really one of the most pro-American countries in the world. And, because of that, American diplomats have a kind of an outsized influence there. But it's also Georgia's also a very conservative country, very traditional country. And as I talked about in the video, one of the more challenging issues that I had to handle was the whole idea of gay rights. Because if you look at public opinion polling, the majority of Georgians are not in favor of equal rights when it comes to marriage in particular. So yeah, I mean, that really, I really had to bring to bear all of my diplomatic powers to really support these very brave young Georgians who wanted to try and open things up in Georgia. And I have also served in countries like Rome when we invaded Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to protest it. And it was difficult to be an American diplomat then. I was in Belgrade in Yugoslavia when the Civil War broke out. And that was probably the place where I experienced the most anti-Americanism because of our support, or not so much our support, but our the way we tried to stop the Serbs in Bosnia from shelling Dubrovnik and other Croatian and Bosnian Muslim communities. So I said being an ambassador is a sweet gig, but it's not all not all champagne and roses if you're an American diplomat, depending on what's going on in the world.
Absolutely. It's not easy for sure. Talking about activism, this question is for Rich. In the past couple of years, we've seen more young people standing up for climate action. This week, we saw the kids at Fridays for Future call on the UK's Standard Chartered Bank to hashtag raise your standards and stop financing fossil fuels. And in return, Standard Chartered deleted the tweets and blocked the group. In today's environment, how do individuals best address corporations who we see as might be ignoring or just being tone deaf to the needs of society, obviously beyond public shaming on Twitter?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think again it goes back to community activism and making purchasing decisions, and decisions with who you do business with and who you don't do business with. I think those are the strongest voices that we can exercise. I would also say working with your local political establishments and having those establishments lobby those organizations and work those organizations too in order to make them do the right thing. I think telling an organization to stop investing in fossil fuels is and convincing them to do so is is a difficult one. I think we all know we're headed in that direction. I think it's going to be a transitional process. I think we all agree that the transition has to be faster than it probably is going to be. But I think the right thing to do is for organizations to get on board with what citizens want and where governments are now going these days, and that is towards more sustainable energy resources versus fossil fuels. We need to be investing in those things. Our government, the U.S. government, this administration certainly is going to be focusing on those investments over the next 4 years, growing our sustainable energy resources with the objective of phasing out fossil fuels over a relatively short period of time. And I'm saying 10 to 20 years is a relatively short period of time when you look at history and all of that. So I think community activism, exercising your right to vote, and who you vote for, and what those candidates represent, and then buying choices again are the biggest ways we can exercise our voice to get companies to do the right things from an environmental, ethical, and social point of view.
Absolutely. Thank you for the reminder. And I think that might be one of the takeaways for today is that on the individual level, there are things that we can do to affect change. And so as a leave behind, I will ask you one last question, and this is for both of you. If you can just provide one advice. Cultural exchange is the first step to practice international diplomacy. So for people who want to go further with overseas careers, what do you suggest for example, being a foreign service officer? And this is for Ian. And for Rich, same question, but does that mean working for a large multinational corporation? So if you can give your quick thoughts on that, let's start with Ian.
Well, I think sign up for the Peace Corps. I mean, that's probably the best thing that you can do. In terms of making yourself competitive in the Foreign Service exam process. What the State Department looks for is people who are culturally adaptable, able to adapt to new cultures, and able to meet challenges in a foreign environment. That's exactly what the Peace Corps does. And just in general, try and get as much experience outside your cultural comfort zone as you can. If you're if you're from rural America, do Teach for America in the inner city. If you live in the city, then go out to say an Indian reservation and help them with issues like building a small business and things like that. Just go outside of your culture, your cultural comfort zone.
From a business perspective, if I'm looking for a quick answer, most countries have restrictions on immigration in those countries, who can work in those countries, versus who can't work in those countries. So the best path that I can think of is to work for a multinational corporation. It doesn't necessarily have to be a large multinational corporation, but it is the best way to develop opportunities to work outside the United States and other countries, is to work for a multinational corporation that has an operation in a country that you might be interested in moving in, and then making known to your leadership in that company that one of the things you desire to do on your career path is to work internationally. That's Wonderful. How I did it, and that's how I would recommend others do it.
Thank you so much for both of you for sharing your insights. I wish we have more time and there are more questions that we can ask, but let's save that to another time. We really have enjoyed speaking with you and learning more about the importance of citizen diplomacy. And really the takeaway is that everyone can have a role and everyone has the power to affect change. And so much appreciated to both of you for your time and for being with us here today.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Excellent. And for everyone else, stay tuned for more. Do you have an idea to share with us about personal development or taking care of our environment or of each other? If so, please email us your idea at connects@greenheart.org. We would love to hear from you and potentially feature you on an upcoming Greenheart Connects episode or highlight you on our social media channels. There is so much that I've learned today, a lot of great information, especially about civic activism. Many thanks to Rich and Ian for joining us, and thanks to all of you who participated and asked questions. Join us on March 18, 2021 at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time when we talk with Nasreen Sheikh about her fair trade enterprise. Nasreen does not know her exact age, as girls' births are not recorded in her village on the India-Nepal border, nor are girls allowed to go to school. When she was only about 9 or 10, Nasreen worked 12 to 15 hours a day in a cramped sweatshop, receiving less than $2 per shift. A serendipitous meeting with a kind stranger allowed her to escape the sweatshop and the forced marriage that her parents had arranged. Nasreen founded Local Women's Handicrafts, LWH, a fair trade sewing collective in Kathmandu. LWH empowers disadvantaged women by providing paid training in clothing and jewelry design. Over 100 women have been trained, many of whom have escaped forced and abusive marriages. LWH women also provide medical help for rural women, distribute backpacks with school supplies to impoverished children, make reusable shopping bags to reduce plastic, and provide disaster relief in times of crisis. We think you will be inspired. You are here because you want to learn about ways to care for our planet and for each other. Thank you for your commitment. Learn more by going to greenheartconnects.org. Later today, this full episode will be available online. As a member, you can also see past episodes to watch other inspirational speakers and engaging topics. Be sure to check out the resources page for more information shared by our speakers. And finally, please join our social media channels to continue the conversation and to support each other, as well to share what you are doing to make the world a better place. Until then, we hope to see you here again, March 18th, 2021, for the next Greenheart Connects episode. Thank you.